Welcome back to the Healing You Show with our host, Gloria Lybecker, and I'm her co-host, Vanessa Harris. And today in episode 13, we would like to explore the healing power of vulnerability.
Yes, it's so good to see you again, Vanessa.
Thanks for having me today.
Yeah, so even unpacking that, the healing power of vulnerability, what comes up for you when you think about vulnerability?
I feel a nervousness, actually, when I think about vulnerability and how much of a struggle it's been for me to be able to be vulnerable, even to be willing to be vulnerable.
Yeah.
But also when I've done that, how incredibly powerful it is. And then I'm willing to do more and more. So it's something that I see is very, very important, but something I've struggled with. That's definitely what comes up when I think about vulnerability.
Yeah, in my experience, that's quite common for us humans. And that can also reflect about our life experiences that perhaps we ended up with some kind of a repercussion after we were vulnerable and trusted someone, that it wasn't reciprocated. And so when we can actually slow down and really be tuned in to our own intention for why we are wanting to be vulnerable or feeling the need to be vulnerable, it can really support and empower us to stay rooted and grounded in our values. For me, vulnerability brings up the flavor. It didn't used to. It used to get me really nervous too. And there are still times that those whispers of nervousness will come up. And yet, the more I've practiced vulnerability, what it does is it actually promotes change. It's like when you're feeling vulnerable, it's because you're riding the wave of change. Because when you're vulnerability, you're revealing something perhaps that's not been revealed before. And that's powerful. And I wonder, how is that for you to hear that piece?
I really like the wave of change. I relate to that. I remember when I very, very first found your work and your parenting courses. And I actually felt very vulnerable because I was looking at things very differently. Going in with this willingness to be open and connect. And there was a lot of change happening. And I remember having it described to me as, I was a bit wondering why sometimes I was a little bit teary and emotional. And someone explaining to me that it was like my heart had been broken open, which kind of felt like it was then ready for this change, to do things differently. Connect from the heart. I couldn't connect from my heart until it had broken open, I guess.
Yeah, and that's a lot different than saying we're brokenhearted. So the words that we use when we describe something really do affect us on a physiological level. So a heart being broken open, it's more of an expansion energy, open-heartedness. That is really, I don't know, it can open to more warmth, compassionate understanding. And trust is a real bedrock of it as well. And when we're willing to be vulnerable and to share our truth, there's something that happens from the inside out, especially when we do that consistently. If we're inconsistent with it, then it really doesn't feel safe. And we stay pretty nervous because we're not practicing it. Yeah.
Yes. And I think that was probably a really great description you had about that expansion of being open-hearted, and I was and feeling everything more intensely. So feeling that love and that warmth and that connection and that caring and understanding, and occasionally, other feelings that weren't so pleasant would bubble up in there amongst that mix. But that was actually okay because it was safe, I guess.
Yeah, well, and also when you are naming your truth, even if you feel angry and you're naming your anger, it's productive energy because it's congruent energy. It's unproductive and incongruent when I'm feeling angry and I put on a face and I pretend everything's well. So there's a lack of authenticity. And when we dare to risk vulnerability, it empowers everyone in the room to feel safe because of the authenticity of that vulnerability. And when someone's truly vulnerable in that way, it activates the whole vagus nerve, which then all of the throat and face, it's going to reflect that emotion as well. And beneath conscious awareness, then people pick up on the micro expressions because our face doesn't lie.
So I'm what I'm hearing there, what I really like is what you're talking about, the congruence. So being vulnerable is not about being weak or soft, or it's about being congruent and expressing honestly, yes, and everything being aligned, which then allows our nervous system to be in sync and then create a message for other people, which then ripples out, I guess, is a way.
Yeah. Well, it's a vulnerability can really empower conversations. So if you've had a disagreement with somebody or been you triggered someone or someone triggered you, when you're willing to take time to be with your own experience first, that's a way of grounding yourself, then you can approach the person with that vulnerability to make the request for what you would like different. And by owning your own experience, it makes it safe for the other person to own their experience.
So as you're describing these things, I'm getting like a sense of I'm visualizing actually this like vulnerability is this like diamond, and there's all these different faces and ways that vulnerability shows up. And part of that is expressing yourself truthfully and showing yourself truthfully and being honest, but also about being willing to connect and change. So there's like all these different facets.
Yeah. And the connection for me, I'm only able to truly be authentically vulnerable when I've taken the time to be self-connected and rooted in my own values. Because then I'm able to be congruent, and I'm also able to be more in choice around how I choose my words, holding my experience with just as much care as the other person's or group's.
So what I'm hearing is the basis of that vulnerability is actually being truthful with yourself first.
Yeah.
And connecting to yourself.
Yeah. So that's probably why I was so nervous when I was younger, because I was most likely not wanting to own things. There's a certain level of maturity that we can grow into as we continue to practice being vulnerable, being authentic, being honest with ourselves. Yeah.
And then that allowing us to be able to respond vulnerably rather than react with some kind of or shell or
well, I think that's
smile.
Really, I think a lot of people pick up on that with when perhaps it starts when we're really young, that we were just innocent and we were vulnerable, and someone else had a bad day and we got the brunt end of that experience. And so then our lesson that we learned was don't ever do that again. And so that can end up running us, and we don't even know that's running us. We just know we don't do that thing called vulnerability because it's painful. And so it's really kind of out of place. But as we grow and we mature and we start to explore life more fully, we can then come back and revisit those beliefs we hold, and we can allow them to shift and to change. Yeah.
And so what I'm hearing, my parent always gets triggered when I hear your words, is often it's, for me, it was your parent or your the people in your family that would be the closest around you when I was having moments of vulnerability, but I'm also aware of the impact I have when I come home having a bad day. And my children have said to me before, when they've expressed emotion and I've reacted to that, defensively or, you know, not in a caring way. Oh, okay, great, Mum. So what? No one allowed to have feelings in this house? Like, since when is that the case? It's a real jolt. That, yeah, well, I'm being vulnerable here, and so there's a respect that it pulls me into knowing that, so I can create that, or not create those situations that then stop people from being comfortable.
Yeah, and also there's another piece here around, especially in parenting or in nurturing any relationship, that we can choose to notice, where do I kind of close my heart and have resistance? Which emotion is it that brings up? So vulnerability, feeling vulnerable, that is an emotion. I feel vulnerable, right? And if that's a place where I have contraction, then I'm not going to be able to, it's going to be uncomfortable when somebody else starts to go there and wants me to hold that space. And so when you have a heart intention for connection with another, and you can be willing to explore it, you can start to open your window of welcome for these emotions that before were uncomfortable.
Okay. I'm just going to be transparent. I missed a little bit of that because of the technical. I had the visual freeze, and the sound went a little bit, but I was catching most of what you were saying about the impact of when you're vulnerable on the other person that you're in relationship with. I'm not sure if I'm capturing it all now. Can you explain it to me again?
Sure. So when we have an experience where vulnerability wasn't something we were comfortable with, because maybe we were vulnerable and then we felt like we weren't met where we were, and so we had a shame reaction to it or some kind of pain, then we don't have a very wide window of welcome for vulnerability in our world. And when we can grow and mature and we can recognize that we have the power to expand our window of welcome, it can encourage us then to be willing to start to open our heart back up. And we can be selective who we choose to do this with. Who do we practice this with in order to get a stronger connection and confidence in that it's safe to be vulnerable?
So then what I'm hearing there makes me think about the healing power. So what you're talking about is learning to expand that window of welcome, and choosing a safe place to start doing that. Which sounds to me like that's where the healing starts and the healing power of the vulnerability comes in.
Precisely.
And I know that's been my experience in working with you, and on circles, and just even being around other people who I know are safe people, and choosing the right person to be able to then.
So we want to have discretion. I don't want to just go out into the next stranger and start just being really vulnerable about things, because that in itself wouldn't be a context that would be congruent. So that's part of the growth process as well. But discovering that it is safe and how it can be safe, and modeling that for others through your own transparent vulnerability. So transparency and vulnerability, they go hand in hand for me. An example I had when I was teaching a communication class for a group of counselors. And these people are all trained to judge, right? And I felt really nervous because there was a lot of people showing up in the room, and I could feel my mind start to go foggy, and I was just vulnerable. And fortunately, I had a mentor that had encouraged me that if you ever get in that place, either run out the door or just be really vulnerable and transparent and just name what's going on and call a pause for yourself. And so I did that. I just said, oh, I'm just going to take a moment just now because I realized that I was starting to just get a little bit clouded in my mind because I'm seeing so many people come in here. I just want to take a moment and take a breath. I just got quiet and I just took a breath. I let everybody watch me. I took like 3 breaths, holding my hand on my chest so I could get my oxytocin to release. And I'm like, oh, thank you. Now, where were we? And I was back. And that was so powerful. It's one that I've come back to, and it was like a stepping stone for my own growth, to trust myself and to know it's possible when I can ground myself in my own truth, and that's what I express. I can't get that wrong. And that's why I'm here. And so I want to practice that consistently so that it's a well-groomed pathway. And how is that for
So
you to hear? Yeah.
I'm really enjoying that, especially with the public speaking, and in front of a group of people who I think it's often harder when you're doing it with people that that you either know or that are on a professional level that could be judging your content. It's easy to go into that spiral, and that there's an authenticity that you're describing. So you're saying vulnerability and transparency go hand in hand, but for me that's also really authentically naming your experience and just saying there's a lot of people walking in the room, and
Yeah.
but you didn't go into overly describing every single little detail, just enough to let people know that you needed a moment.
Yeah.
So being vulnerable, there's still those healthy boundaries there as well, from what I'm hearing you describe.
Yeah. Well, authentic limits, I like to call them. You know, because they're authentic, and I know my limitations, and I'm going to take care of myself. And I'm going to be able to make really clear requests around that too. So that's part of me owning and being responsible for my own sense of self and modeling that. And when I'm unable to actually pull it off, then I can make a repair and can come back around. Yeah. And so that's the
I
power
love that.
of staying in conversation, first here and then with the other person.
In conversation with self, and then conversation with the other person. I love that term, that distinction that you made about the limits, authentic limits, as opposed to boundaries. I hear the word boundaries get thrown around a lot. But for me, it does invoke a sense of a boundary fence or a wall, you know, like don't cross my boundary, you know, and it's about protecting it, and it doesn't really work with the limits. But when you're talking about authentic limits, it's also connecting yourself, because I'm hearing you recognizing what your capacity is in that moment to deal with. And it's about your limit, and my limit might be here one day and there the next, like further out. And that another person's is going to be different.
Yeah. Yeah. So how do you negotiate those energetic boundaries even? So I'm only able to really be, well, you can develop your capacity to sense your own and others' energetic boundaries, and yet, so there's always a need for consent. So for me, when I have authentic limits, I'm being a lot more proactive and relational. Because when I stay relational, I can set authentic limits. When I shift left and I'm more in strategy, I'm setting boundaries. And that's a whole different felt sense, you know, because the other person can feel the relationship's not there, that they've become an object.
So what I'm hearing there is another link between vulnerability and being relational. It's almost an essential ingredient, by the sound of it, in order to be relational and connect with others. There's a certain level of vulnerability that's required.
Well, I think there's different layers of that. As with anything, you know, there's a spectrum. So here's total open, I share everything. And then there's the discretion where I may just share internally and vulnerably with my own sense of self, Because even when I do that, my belief is that the quantum field of energy moves out from there without me having to use words. And I experience that with my horses all the time. And it's powerful. But when I can be aware of it and I'm in alignment with my values, you know, I don't necessarily need to speak all the time. But then there's also a felt sense that others can feel in the room or in the area or the space. So, what were you going to say?
Well, what I'm just thinking of when you're saying that is when I've heard you in the past talk about sometimes for other people, and there'll be different people that I'll share different things with in different levels and different layers and different depths. Sometimes one word is one word too many. So I can recognize it and hold it myself, but my limit will tell me that that's not something I should share with that particular person at this moment. That could be too many words, or it might not be something that they're comfortable with or that they have the capacity to process. But I'm still tuning in with myself and being vulnerable.
Yeah, and also what I'm hearing that you're bringing in that's I love is how our intuition can really support us in having those discretions to be able to really have a solid self connection that guides me as I'm being relational with others.
And when you talk about intuition, you mentioned earlier, I'm not sure if it was when we were speaking or in this conversation right now, but about the social engagement system. Is that what you would refer to as intuition? Is that part of the intuition and part of being vulnerable?
Well, I think intuition, the people receive energy and information flow in different ways. And one of the ways we receive it is through our guts. You know, we have our sensory organs, and those are guiding us all of the time, and most of us aren't aware of it. Unless you get like me and you get very fascinated with understanding how this system works, it can really begin to inform you, and you can begin to notice. So like they say trust your gut. Your gut instinct's going to be right all the time, and I've always trusted my gut. I would have a hunch. I would just know something, especially about my children, and I would just go with it. And sure enough, it would prove itself out. And so we can receive information from our environment through our sensory organs that inform us, and we can develop our capacity to slow down and actually notice that and be more horse-like is how I like to put it. I'm actually one with my environment then. I'm not all up in my head thinking I know it all. And so that's really living in present time.
So what I hear you describing and relating to the horses explains to me why when I have been feeling overwhelmed or very emotional or dealing with a large amount of stress or holding a lot of pieces, I find myself craving contact with horses. Having worked with your horses and having had such a powerful experience, and now I'm understanding what that is about and what it is that I'm actually wanting. It's that groundedness and self-connection.
Yeah.
And allowing myself to, it's the vulnerability that I'm actually comfortable with the horse, because the horse doesn't judge, I guess. And there's something there where there's a connection that allows connection to myself. I'm starting to understand that in a different level as you described that.
Yeah. Yeah, and most people, when they've come out to be introduced to the herd, they will express that they feel quite, vulnerable as they step into the arena with them. And then there's also well, the horses, they have really big guts, really big hearts. And so that really informs them too. And they're tuning in to our being, the way that they communicate with life. And what that does is it actually supports our system to remember who we were created to be. And that's what really has been so powerful for me in my life. So, yeah, learning how to translate that then over to the humans, that can take a little
Well,
bit
they
more
actually,
practice.
so I remember when I was with your herd, and several of the horses kept nudging my gut, directly in my gut with their nose.
Yeah.
Um, that was, it was like they were telling me to tune in there.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I needed to be listening, I guess, and focusing. And I do relate to that experience of tuning into. How can other people learn? You say we can learn to tune into that and expand our tolerance, our window for welcome.
Mm-hmm.
How do you go about doing that? What is the way that people would develop that?
Well, it could be just starting with yourself, noticing. That's the very first key, to really awaken yourself, is to begin to notice. I can remember when I first started practicing noticing, because I wanted something different in my life. And I wanted to be able to, rather than being fear-based, I wanted to be able to trust, which would then I could see I'd need to be vulnerable and talk to people. And that didn't feel so safe. And yet I really had a powerful motivator, which was my children. And so I started practicing, noticing my body, noticing. I would go to my mind so quick and slowing down and then noticing my body. And then when I finally got to the point where I was noticing, I got almost giddy with excitement because I'd been practicing long enough that now it was becoming more automatic to go there. So as with anything that we're going to begin learning to do that's new, we need repetition that's consistent. And so when we are willing to just develop even a little mindfulness practice of noticing, oh, have I gone up in my head and I'm telling a story? Oh, what's happening in my body when I tell myself that story? And notice it and begin to name it. So even being able to develop a language that has all the different kinds of sensations. There's many people I work with, they don't have words for sensations because many times they've cut off from their bodies and they only listen to their head. So
Yes.
beginning to slow down and notice what I'm telling myself. When I tell myself that, what happens in my body? That's like
Mm-hmm.
very first basic. And then a practice could be then, if you name it, then that feels pretty vulnerable. And so having someone like, I really highly recommend having empathy buddies, somebody that you practice consistently, listening deeply with your heart, and then being listened to and being able to express from your heart and being able to reciprocate that. That's going to really support that neural pathway to really become firm and solid, and you can count on it.
So I'm really hearing that there's actually like a process that you go through, and I'm aware of the times when I've heard you take me through when you say to me, "Oh, how are you feeling?" or "What is it? Where do you feel that in the body?" But before you, often when I'm talking, and I can get really up in my head, I live right up there, and I can get very analytical. And I hear you say, I just want to slow that down for a moment, or I want to slow this right down, or just go back to this moment.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then you say, where do you feel that in your body? It's actually something that I found hard to do by myself.
Yeah.
I having the experience of being accompanied and taken through that process has now allowed me to be able to automatically start doing it by myself.
Yeah.
But I did find it I found it very supportive to have you take me through that process to
Yeah.
begin.
Well, and that's where I began too, with an empathy buddy and having a commitment to connect every week at least, if not more often. And then when you start to have a relationship like that, you're going to have inevitable ruptures. And so also having an agreement that is, no matter what happens, we will make a repair in order to start to create an enduring relationship that you can trust, that you do matter even when you disagree. And that's really important. So we do need accompaniment. We were created for a relationship. We're not meant to do this life by ourselves. And so when we can be vulnerable, it allows the other person to feel safe. So then they're able to be vulnerable as well. And that's a real sacred container. I hold it with a lot of care and a lot of warmth, and I'm not in a hurry with it. Yeah.
And when you talk about the empathy buddy, and that repair and that safe container, I'm thinking about my instinct used to be, or my automatic strategy was always to use my husband, always to go to him, and always to have to be that person for him. I've got to be a listener, I've got to provide, I've got to take him through these things. And sometimes it would get really exhausting, and sometimes it was about me and I didn't want to listen to it, and I'd get triggered, and then we'd just end up in an argument. I remember when I encouraged him to start joining the circles, I was so relieved, because there was like, I don't have to be everything to this person anymore. And because I'd already had the experience of, I don't have to go to you when you don't have the capacity to accompany me. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so my empathy buddy doesn't have to be my life partner, I guess is.
No, it can be very healthy to have even more than one empathy buddy, but to have somebody that so they can be a resource for you. So you have a place that you can go that's held with confidence and competency. So confidentiality, all of those things are really important. And to have an agreement about what that's going to look like. Yeah, that's a great question to ask. And so I would like to then let any of our viewers know that that there's some resources on the website. One of them, I don't know if I have it available as like just a free resource, but when people sign up, then they actually get a download that actually has this process printed out. It's not in as much detail. Maybe I need to go back and update it, but I would like to make that resource available for folks to have.
And that resource specifically is the process of checking in with yourself? Is that what you're talking about? Or the empathy buddy process?
No, it's the basics of this way of communicating, the language of life. You know, so it talks about how you slow down. You start with the observation, you go into sensations and feelings, and then the beauty of the need, and then you end with a request. So that's a basic way of using nonviolent communication or compassionate communication, or what I call a language of life. And that can be really helpful to use. And many of my clients will use it even in their marriage or in their relationships. They'll have it as kind of a guide to help with those stepping stones, to know how to slow it down so they can practice. So it could be a resource for people to use and start to develop some empathy buddy relationships.
And I just want to point out there, because when you're describing that language of life and that connection and that nonviolent communication, there's something that I was always, when I focused on using with others, listening to others with empathy, listening to others with care, connecting. But what I needed to do first was to use that language of life with myself.
Yes.
So take myself through that process. It's like I need to listen to myself and go through that process and use that observation and feeling and need and request of myself first.
Yes.
And then that allowed me to be able to do that effectively with others.
Yeah, so that's really slowing down to be heart connected first, so that it opens and open-hearted, that you can then hear the other person. So yes, it's beautiful.
So that whole process that you're describing there, that language of life actually requires vulnerability in order to be able to step into that space and connect in that way.
Yeah, it enhances the whole area. It does. It creates that neuroception of safety.
And so I'm wondering I know that there's people who talk to me and they find it hard to find people to listen to them or to be an empathy buddy, when they don't have any capacity to listen without judgment or evaluation or giving strategy. Like, I think one of the things with vulnerability for me is when you talk about your things vulnerably, and then people just suddenly want to throw solutions at you and fix you, which makes I personally then want to just recoil and close back up again. It's like, no, it's actually not what I wanted. I wasn't looking for a solution. Just wanting to, connect and be heard, understood. And, so where can people find that, or what opportunities do they have through you offer, I guess, is probably what I'm thinking of, if they don't have that available in their immediate environment?
Yeah, so what I recommend is, if people are interested in getting to participate in some small group structures, that there are some new ones that I'm going to be having available starting at the beginning of 2020, where I'll be opening up a course for people to begin to step in to develop their capacity to practice this. And in that, then you'll meet other people that you can resonate with and reach out to one another to begin to practice being empathy buddies. And there's actually an early sign up that people can get to see, and that's on my website at www.healingyouShow.com. And on the home page, they scroll down, you can sign up on the wait list to get to hear when when it's going to launch. Because I'm going to have a free course that's available for people to listen to, so they can be at choice each step of the way, to see if it's going to be a good fit for them.
Okay. So there's a free course. What will that course involve?
The free course is a 5-part video series where
Right.
they will get to watch the video, and I'll walk them through what the course is all about. It's the Healing You method. And yeah, I'm pretty excited about it. It's been fun. And it's just launching on the new moon. So as far as being available for people to come and get to explore the course and to see what might work well for them.
I like the sound of that, being able to look and see what things will look like. To be able to choose whether you think that's a good fit.
Yeah, that's important. It's really important.
And getting a taste of what it would look like, or an understanding, I guess, of how it actually looks in action.
Yeah, they're going to kind of try it on first. Yeah.
Which will definitely help. I think that will definitely help people also, because when we talk about vulnerability, if it's something very foreign to people, I think a lot of people might just go, yeah, no thanks. But actually seeing it in that context, step by step, and getting introduced to it slowly. And I like what you said about being in choice each step of the way. You get to choose how much you participate or how vulnerable you be.
Yes. Yeah. That is what it's all about. So I think we've got quite a bit here for our viewers to get to sink into. And I will look forward to getting to get back together with you again on our next episode of Healing You.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Vanessa.
Bye. See you next time.